International human rights law and the domestic laws of European countries recognise that everyone has a fundamental right to liberty. But our societies also recognise some situations where it can be legitimate for a state to deprive some individuals of their liberty. These are situations where some competing right is at stake. For example, most states imprison people who have committed serious crimes. There are also situations where adults may consent to giving up their freedom. For example, we may consent to be placed under a general anaesthetic in order to undergo surgery. But difficult issues arise when adults who may be unable to freely give their consent need types of care which may deprive them of their liberty. In my work as a legal framework trainer, I work with social workers and others in the health and care sector who routinely deal with the processes around authorising deprivations of liberty in care settings in England. And I'm sure that there are people here in the audience who work in roles where that is the case. But often in the day-to-day processes of completing seemingly endless assessments, reports, and forms, it is difficult to take a step back and really think about what we are doing and why. So I hope you'll forgive me if I go back to basics in looking at the issue. The group of people I'm talking about are those who are cared for in circumstances where their freedom of choice is so restricted as to mean they are being deprived of their liberty. Now, this affects a wide range of people, but it includes many autistic people. The group we are talking about includes people who have no objections to the circumstances in which they're being cared for and who seem perfectly happy. I'm also including in this group situations where the care being provided is very much in the person's best interests. Many countries are struggling with similar issues to those currently under discussion in England around how to uphold the rights of autistic adults and others who may need to be cared for in circumstances which significantly restrict their freedom and choices. I often hear this from social workers, from others in care, and from families. Why do we need lots of extra paperwork? Surely if someone's happy and the care is the best thing for them, then that's enough. Why do we need all this extra paperwork? But this is about who gets to decide that. Who gets to say that the care is the best thing for them and that it is justified to deprive them of their liberty in order to provide that care. This is also crucially about recognising that autistic adults have the same rights to freedom and self-determination as anyone else. And if we are to secure those rights, then there needs to be an independent check on situations where adults are being cared for in circumstances where they're deprived of their liberty. Such an independent check may well conclude that it is justified to deprive someone of their liberty, that it's the right thing to do. But it needs to be possible for someone independent of those providing the care to decide that it is not justified. Does this really matter? Surely in most cases, those who care for someone are best placed to decide what is best for them. Doesn't this just create more layers of bureaucracy that are in nobody's interests? Well, what about situations where it goes wrong? Power can corrupt, and mistakes happen. If there is no protection in law for fundamental rights, then there is nowhere to go for help. And what about those, a large proportion of autistic adults who are cared for under these sorts of circumstances, who have no one who cares other than paid staff who have no family, no friends, and no independent involvement in their care at all. And what about care systems, most of them in fact, where there is a chronic attitude of paternalism towards autistic adults, especially those with intellectual disabilities, and where families accustomed to treating their autistic young person as a child struggle to allow them to grow up and continue to want what's best for them to an inappropriate degree of involvement, and professional carers who have the best of intentions. Sometimes those who care can be too close to objectively judge the situation. Crucially, the issues around deprivation of liberty are fundamentally about who is in control of people's lives. This is not ultimately about community living or about getting people out of hospital, though those are important goals in themselves. It's about who is in control. It's about autonomy. So I'd like to briefly outline the current situation in England as an example of the struggle over what to do about deprivation of liberty and how to do it. In England, we have the deprivation of liberty safeguards. These were brought in 2009 to plug the so-called Bournemouth gap after a European Court of Human Rights case which concerned an autistic man in 2004. They apply only in situations in care homes and in hospitals. They require that a deprivation of liberty must be authorised by a supervisory body, usually the local authority, and reviewed at least once per year. And crucially, they provide that the authorisation can be appealed to the Court of Protection, thus providing a legal safeguard. But there are a number of problems with them. Deprivations of liberty in community settings, such as supported living or care provided in someone's own home, must be authorised by the Court of Protection because those settings are not covered by the current system. And they are widely seen as overly bureaucratic and unwieldy. They're also not well understood, and the system has never been particularly well implemented. But the system lurched along a little unsteadily for some 5 years, until in 2014, the Supreme Court rendered a decision in 3 cases brought together and known as Cheshire West. That decision broadened the understanding of what we mean when we say that someone is deprived of their liberty, and essentially decided that an individual is deprived of their liberty in any situation where they are under continuous supervision and control and are not free to leave in the sense of being able to decide to go and live somewhere else. One of the judges involved, Lady Hale, famously stated in the judgment, "A gilded cage is still a cage." This was a seminal decision in terms of disability rights, because she also said human rights are for everyone, including the most disabled members of our community, and those rights include the same right to liberty as everyone else. This was a huge step forward in the acknowledgement of disability rights, but it led to meltdown in the already troubled deprivation of liberty safeguards system. There's lots of paperwork and not nearly enough resources to cope with it. And the lack of provision for community settings further complicated the issue. Essentially, the current English situation can be summarised like this. It is one of overload, meltdown, to use autistic terminology. There's also widespread confusion and a lack of understanding of the purpose and meaning of the safeguards. For example, It's not entirely uncommon to hear social workers make statements along the lines of, so-and-so just needs to be Cheshired. There is a perception that the deprivation of liberty safeguards are either some kind of rubber stamp that doesn't really mean anything, or another misunderstanding, which is quite common amongst relatives, is that a dole's authorization itself is a license to detain someone against their will, and that if we don't apply for a dole's authorization, then that will mean that the person is not detained. Whereas that's not, in fact, the case at all. A dole's authorization is a recognition that the circumstances in which someone is being cared for are depriving them of their liberty, and it's a decision that in those circumstances that deprivation is justified. So the current English situation around the Mental Capacity Act more broadly is this. The House of Lords commented relatively recently that the empowering ethos of the Act had not been delivered, that the rights conferred by the Act have not been widely realised, and the duties, including those in the deprivation of liberty safeguards, are not widely followed. So, at the moment, there is a process of debating reform underway. The Law Commission was asked to consider possible options for reform. And they came out with some highly detailed proposals for 3 different schemes adapted to different environments, with quite carefully thought through checks and balances to ensure the protection of an individual's right to liberty and also to home and family life. Unfortunately, the government's response to these proposals was not particularly positive. The government response was seemingly very focused on the issue of care and much less on the issue of rights. Unfortunately, the current English government is seemingly fairly oblivious to the relevance of human rights and the importance of legal safeguards, and sees law merely as unnecessary bureaucracy. The Law Commission has yet to publish its final recommendations, but they have issued a rather limited interim response to the government's position. And from what can be read between the lines, this is an attempt to walk a rather tricky balancing act between the vital importance of defending people's rights whilst trying to come up with a scheme that is likely to be politically acceptable. We don't yet know what form the final proposals are going to take, but it looks now, sadly, as if this is very unlikely to be an opportunity to progress rights. Rather, the Law Commission is now fighting a rearguard action to preserve a basic level of protection for rights and prevent the adoption of a system which will once again fall short even of the standards of the European Convention on Human Rights, let alone the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. So I'd just like to finish by talking briefly about why this is an autism issue. Why are we talking about this at an autism conference? Well, large numbers of autistic adults are affected by these issues. No one knows how many, because statistics aren't collected separately for autistic adults from the broader learning disabled population. And it's also a very important issue because the system is currently in an enormous mess in England, with an awful lot of people being deprived of their liberty without any proper authorization. It's an autism issue because for autistic adults, such deprivations of liberty can be lifelong in the care circumstances where they are going to spend their entire lives. And their needs are therefore somewhat different in those circumstances from that of the larger elderly group who are affected. It's also an autism issue because the standard of assessment of mental capacity is quite poor across the board, but it's particularly poor in the case of autistic people, because autism knowledge is not particularly good in the social care and health sector, and this leads to an awful lot of under- and overestimation of capacity amongst professionals. So independent reviews are particularly important for the care of autistic people. So in my view, it is very important that the autism world gets involved in the current debate in England and elsewhere. And this is what I see the key issues as being. On what basis should a decision be made to infringe someone's liberty? Is having a disability in itself a good reason? I believe that Alex Ruck-Keene is going to cover this issue further, but I would argue for the view taken by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that a deprivation of liberty must be justified entirely on the basis of a competing right and not differentially on the basis of diagnosis or disability. The second crucial issue is what the Law Commission in England is currently struggling with: how to create a legally robust protection for such a large group of individuals in such a variety of settings, which is actually manageable on a practical level. And how to ensure that what progress has been made in terms of disability rights by the Cheshire West judgment is not undone by the current political climate, which is rather anti-human rights in England, not to mention anti-Europe. So these struggles are not unlike historical processes which have led to the emancipation and progression of the rights of other groups in societies around the world. But it's important to recognize that these struggles involve issues of resources, practical issues, and cultural change, which are never easy and are likely to take time and difficult decisions. In my view, it's difficult to see how any new deprivation of liberty safeguard scheme is really likely to make significant difference on the ground to the treatment or protection of the rights of autistic adults in care settings, though I do agree that something needs to be done to resolve the current total stalemate. The key problems go wider. They're about culture and attitudes towards autistic adults and widespread paternalism in the care system. The core of the issue here is that there's a widespread unspoken discomfort with acknowledging the reality that many autistic adults are, with the best of intentions, having their rights infringed by those who care for them. It is more comfortable to sweep that infringement under the carpet and ignore it. It's very uncomfortable to face it and acknowledge that infringement and accept being challenged to justify why, in a particular case, it is justified. But it's very important that those who care face their discomfort and accept how necessary it is to progress, just as happened, for example, in the history of black rights through the acknowledgement of concepts such as institutional racism. Law reform can help, though I think, as I argued elsewhere this morning, that fundamental reform of mental capacity law to enshrine the right to full and equal legal capacity in law in line with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is an important prerequisite to change thinking. But even without that, it is vital that we have a rights-based approach. The social care sector needs education to improve legal literacy and an understanding of the relevance of human rights amongst social care and health professionals and for families and the wider community. Thank you.
Hello, so it is my pleasure being with you today to make this presentation on a very important and serious subject, which is the deprivation of liberty of people with autism. And so the purpose will be to present to you the standards and the principles to have in mind for these people to remain happy, healthy, and empowered. And as everybody knows, the deprivation of liberty does not respond to these criteria. So what is important to keep in mind today is that since the signature and ratification by most of the European countries, if not all European countries, the standards which are retained by the UN Convention are a lot higher than the standards retained by the Council of Europe, although the Council of Europe is in Europe known as being the Organization of Human Rights, but it has to improve its standards, as we will see. So there is a real need of an evolution of the case law and of the practices in our countries in Europe. Because just to mention that when I prepared, while I was preparing this presentation, I read some horrifying stories of today, 2016, in many countries and in countries such as France as well, where actually the situation of people with autism deprived of their liberty, treated in hospitals for several years or for all their life actually, is probably worse than the treatment that people could have in prisons. And this is not my judgment, this is actually the judgment of an independent authority in France which made a report on these treatments in hospitals, so, of a public independent authority. So what are the criteria of the European Convention on Human Rights? This convention, as you know, is quite old, I would say, 1949. It is very well advanced in terms of definition of human rights, and there is a very interesting case law of the European Court on Human Rights. That being said, these criteria are not anymore in line with the criteria of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. First, because Article 5 does permit the possible detention of persons of unsound minds. What does this mean? So it is also said among the criteria that the detention must be necessary, what necessary means, and proportionate. And so this article states the lawfulness, I would say, of the detention on mental health grounds. Of course, there are some procedural safeguards, but in terms of deprivation of liberty, the idea is to avoid them, not to prevent, not only to cure them. So there are several case law rendered by the European Court of Human Rights. I'd like to mention some of them, especially one which is quite old, not too old, but a little bit old now, regarding a person with autism, which was transferred to a hospital for having inflicted harm to himself. And he was treated as a voluntary patient, saying, well, you voluntarily came to hospital. Of course, this was not true, because this was only based on the clinical assessment of the healthcare professionals. So the court decided that it was an arbitrary deprivation of liberty on grounds of necessity. And it was a good decision for that. More recent decisions in 2012 regarding not people suffering for autism, but it could have been the same type of decision. Again, the admission to an institution was done at the request of the applicant's relatives, because it's not a valid criteria, but it was against his will. And unfortunately, in the country at stake, it was impossible under law to have the lawfulness of his deprivation of liberty examined. So this was not indeed admitted by the court, and since none of the exceptions provided in Article 5 were applicable, it was not a valid decision. There was a violation of the right to have the lawfulness of detention decided speedily, this is a criteria, and the violation of the right for, to receive compensation. Unfortunately, the same year, another decision was rendered, and there the court decided that actually there was no violation of the right to liberty, since it was established that the applicant suffered from a mental disorder. So you see, it is really not a well-advanced case law in a way. And, but still, the decision was in favor of the applicant because there was no separate legal representation permitting, in fact, the person to express a view, and that's why there was a violation of the right to have the lawfulness of detention decided speedily by the court. But as you see, the case law of the European Court on Human Rights is really based on procedural safeguards, just to cure, but not to prevent and not to impede. Now let's look at the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It went very far. Sometimes people may think that it's just a kind of fantasy or of a dream, but actually it's quite possible to implement it. So there is this Article 14, which is the most important article to keep in mind, but of course it must be read in conjunction with the other principles of the UN Convention. So right to liberty and security, it goes together. And what is said is that by the UN Convention and by the committee, the UN Committee for the Defense of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it is one of the most precious rights. It's obvious if you think yourself, liberty and security is certainly the most important thing that you want to keep. So that's the same for our people. So, of course, persons with autism cannot be deprived of liberty arbitrarily. So they must follow the same criteria for them. The criteria applicable to other people must apply to them. And of course, there is an absolute prohibition of any deprivation of liberty on the basis of a mental disability. As you see, there is a huge difference with the criteria which are retained by Article 5 of the European Convention. The basis of a mental disability is absolutely not applicable. Just a parenthesis which is interesting. At the time the UN Convention was drafted, some discussion was about the idea to, do we consider that it is we prohibit deprivation of liberty exclusively on the basis of mental disability or just on the basis of a mental disability. It has been expressly said that the word exclusively would not be applicable. Why so? Because if the convention had written, exclusively, it means that all health professionals could say, no, it's not exclusively on the mental disability, it's because he hurts himself, whatever. And so you'd have all possibilities to deprive liberty. So that's something important to keep in mind. As I said, it is a non-discrimination provision. And of course, it is done to respect the inherent dignity of the person. Non-discrimination because criteria for our people must be the same as for any other person. As I said, it's an absolute prohibition of detention, so no exceptions on the ground of autism, actual or perceived, and even, as I said, if additional factors are used to justify the deprivation of liberty, such as he hurts himself or so. This article must be read in conjunction with the principle of equal recognition before the law, which is the fact that anyone has a legal capacity to decide of his or her life. So, but we will focus later on the low functioning people, because it's always a debate about that. And you can believe me, I mean, I'm the mother of a young adult, but a young low-functioning adult with autism, totally nonverbal and with a very important mental disability. So the concept is that no involuntary or non-consensual commitment in mental health institutions. This is really the rule, because if there is any involuntary or non-consensual commitment in mental health institutions, this is a denial of the person's legal capacity to decide about care, treatment, and admission. We will see the criteria to be retained for the most serious cases. Article 14 must also be read in conjunction with the prohibition of torture and of cruel, inhuman, and degraded treatments, which is in Article 15 of the Convention. And God knows that in hospitals, in these specific institutions where they have for life some adults with autism, there are many treatments which are very close to torture, cruel, and inhuman, and degrading treatments. So the concept is that we must retain the free and informed consent to treatment, even in emergency and crisis situation. Just mentioning that these principles that I present to you are results from a guidance, from guidelines, which were drafted by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These guidelines were published just a year ago in September 2015, and that's very interesting to look at them. You can find them on the internet, and it's the guideline on Article 14. So the concept is that there is a need to ensure that assistants or support persons do not substitute or have undue influence over the decisions of persons with autism. This is really related, to Article 12 on legal capacity. There is no substitution. But of course, it's quite difficult sometimes for people, having very difficult behaviors, who are low functioning, nonverbal, who apparently do not understand, who have high difficulties to express any choice. Although we will see there are alternatives. It is quite difficult to say, well, let's leave them decide about being in hospital, in an institution or so. I agree with that. But the last guidance given by the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is quite interesting. Because in many cases, these assistants or support persons will decide, and this is also the criteria which is mostly written in Europe, in the best interest of the persons. But the notion of best interest must be replaced by the standard of best interpretation of the will and preferences. This is quite important because we know now that the guardian is not just someone neutral or far from the person. The idea is that I know my son, or I know this person very well for several years. I know what he likes. He is nonverbal. He cannot express his or her frustration. Well, she cannot express his or her frustration. You don't understand why there is a crisis. Don't put him in a hospital. It will not help. I know what can help him. I know what he likes. And this is the best way to avoid it is unlawful detention, to deprive of liberty in an arbitrary manner, and to make sure to find the best alternatives because they do exist. So actually, again, also regarding the danger for maybe not the low functioning but higher functioning, there is also a freedom to take risks. When you take a decision, you can take risks. So the best interest, there are many decisions probably that all of us took which were not maybe in our best interest, but we were free to take them. This is very important. Also the same thing, of course, if our people do not act properly under regular legal standards, they must, of course, respond before the courts of their acts. And they have the right to due process and fair trial, equal protection before law, guarantees, accessibility, procedural accommodations. This is what is needed. The idea is really to implement through, again, this article must be read also in conjunction with Article 19. The idea is the right to live independently and be included in the society. And if needed, of course, to have all the necessary support services and to lead to an effective deinstitutionalization, which is really defined at the EU level, with organization of persons with autism. So if you do choose these alternatives, there is no need to be deprived of liberty on any other basis, not more than for any other person. So you really can reach, let's say, a full abolition, if I may say so, of unlawful deprivation of liberties in hospitals, for example. There must be, of course, monitoring of facilities and programs to prevent all forms of exploitation, violence, and abuse. And these controls should be carried out by national independent authority with the participation of the civil society. Now let's go back to Europe for a while. Considering the criteria and the standards which are now those of the UN Convention, which can be implemented, and it means that many things must be teared down, if I may say so, in Europe. The Council of Europe indeed made some progress in the criteria to be retained. And in fact, the Committee on Social Affairs, Health and Sustainable Development, which is a committee which works for the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, decided very recently in 2014 that there was a need for the Council of Europe to be really compatible in its policy with the UN Convention. And there was a real need to promote alternatives to involuntary measures in psychiatry. So this is quite important because there had been an attempt to have, a new instrument of the Council of Europe to define the criteria for involuntary placement. And this Committee on Social Affairs said, no additional instrument on this, just let's stick to the UN Convention standards. And unfortunately, more recently, in June 2016, the Steering Committee for Human Rights, which is close to the Committee of Ministers, to the Council of Europe Committee of Ministers, decided that sometimes still, considering the legislation in many member states, under certain circumstances, involuntary measures may be warranted, justified in order to prevent the patient causing harm to him or herself or other persons. So going back to the old European standards. And on the basis of a recent decision of the European Court of Human Rights, which, in my opinion, is absolutely not in line with the UN Convention standards, because this decision says that a mental disorder may be considered as being of a degree, what does it mean, warranting compulsory confinement, which is even more than the deprivation of liberty. The confinement of the person concerned is necessary as the person needs therapy, medication, or other clinical treatment to cure, alleviate his or her condition. And the person needs control, supervision to prevent him, her from, for example, this is the wording of the court, for example, so, other cases could happen, causing harm to him, herself, or other persons. So it's really going back to the old European standards. And the steering committee added that since involuntary measures continue to be provided for in the laws of member states, this is absolutely not a justification. There is a need to ensure that involuntary measures are embedded with the guarantees required by the European Convention. But these guarantees, we saw that, are absolutely not in line with the UN Convention guarantees. So there is a need to provide for the possibility for the right to an effective remedy against such measures. Okay, fine, you have the procedural remedies, but this is not an alternative. The UN Convention is asking for alternatives. And of course, they say, well, this committee says that involuntary measures should remain exceptional, only be advantageous in the absence of alternatives. But that's the issue. We need to put in place alternatives. We don't need to keep these old standards in the absence of alternatives. We need to implement now, today, alternatives, because they do exist in many countries. We know that, fortunately. So for the steering committee, this would permit a progressive transition to a more uniform application of voluntary measures. But we don't need this progressive transition. We need to implement today the UN Convention standards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak at this panel discussion, because I think it really is a vitally important issue. I've got to start with a standard caveat. These are personal views that I'm going to express. They have absolutely nothing to do with the work that I'm doing at the Law Commission at the moment with them on the Deprivation of Liberty project. And from anyone from England who wants to know anything about it, I can't tell you anything about it. I can point you to the interim statement and ask you to look at it, but I'm banned from talking about it. From anyone who's not from England, you're probably not that bothered. So just very quickly, because Yo and Evelyn in different ways have really covered a lot of the ground, which allows me to focus on asking some questions. But I just want to reinforce a point that for those of you coming from a non-England perspective, or possibly a non-UK perspective, some of you might be thinking, the position in England seems quite unusual, that we now have a definition of deprivation of liberty which is incredibly broad. If you're under continuous supervision and control, and you're not free to leave somewhere, then no matter how benign the intentions of the people exercising that control, no matter how normal the placement in which that control is taking place, that is irrelevant. If you're under that degree of control and you don't have the ability to consent to it, and the state is responsible, that is, in England and Wales, we have decided, a deprivation of liberty. Yo says it's a great step forward in disability rights. I'd really like to agree with her. At the moment, it's looking a lot like a Pyrrhic victory. We now have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in England and Wales, and by application in Scotland and Northern Ireland, who are said to be deprived of their liberty. We've got a system which is creaking, which is not responding terribly well, and it's collapsing under its own weight. That's what the Law Commission is attempting to grapple with. In the background, and I just want to pick up a couple of things that Evelyn said, we do have this big conundrum going on. It's a really big moment in international law as to what do we actually mean, or what are we actually trying to achieve here? Because we've got Article 14 of the CRPD, which is a huge challenge, I cannot emphasize that enough, to the entirety of the way in which health and social care structures are set up in European Council or Council of Europe countries who have been merrily operating on Article 5 of the European Convention thinking, we're okay so long as we can say we're dealing with someone with a mental disorder and we can justify it, we don't have a problem. Because the Convention says, and Evelyn highlighted this very starkly, the existence of a disability shall in no case justify a deprivation of liberty, according to Article 14 of the CRPD. And these are the guidelines that Evelyn referred to. And just to highlight, the practice, the committee says, is incompatible with Article 14, it's discriminatory in nature, and amounts to arbitrary deprivation of liberty. That is a massive, massive challenge. And I had the privilege of hearing Teresia de Gainer, the Vice Chair of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, talking over the past couple of days at the World Guardianship Congress in Berlin. And she emphasized again and again, in every context she could, they mean it. And they also really do mean you cannot implement forced treatment, i.e. treatment where you do not have the free and informed consent of the person concerned. We do have, annoyingly, for lawyers at least, or lawyers consider this fun and interesting, utterly unhelpful. Whenever a lawyer says something's interesting, any non-lawyer should know this is not good. Lawyers think this is interesting, but this is the grown-ups, the people at the highest level of the UN who are trying to tell us how we're supposed to move our practice forward can't agree. The Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities are telling us we cannot have deprivation of liberty on the basis of disability, even if coupled with some additional factor. The Human Rights Committee of the UN, which looks after, amongst other instruments, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which gives us Article 9, the right to liberty, says, pretty much contemporaneously with the UN Committee, the existence of a disability shall not in itself justify deprivation of liberty, but you can have it if it's necessary and proportionate. Those of you who are not yet desperate for lunch and trying to think about leaving for it might be thinking, hang on, Those two statements don't sit together. They don't. They are completely incompatible. And they represent, I think, real challenges amongst different groups of people with different emphases as to what's at stake here. So we've got these tensions between the UN human rights bodies, between the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which says you cannot, according to the committee, deprive someone of their liberty on the basis of a disability, even if you're saying, I'm not really doing it because of the disability, I'm doing it because they are a danger to someone else or to themselves. That's what the CRPD says. European Convention says you're allowed to do that. The Supreme Court in England and Wales, in the Cheshire West case, had that put to them. They ducked it. They recognised an incompatibility. They just didn't want to engage with it. But lurking, and I just want to close with a few questions here, lurking behind all of this is some much bigger picture stuff which I want you to think about. What do we actually mean by deprivation of liberty? Because everyone says it, but we haven't sat down and really necessarily thought what we mean. And is the meaning the same in Article 5 of the European Convention, which troubles European countries, as it is in Article 14 of the CRPD? What do we mean? The right to liberty should clearly be the same for everyone, but that doesn't actually in and of itself say very much, because you could have exactly the same right for everyone and it'd be a very narrow one. Lady Hale in Cheshire West gave it a very, very broad description. And I think underpinning some of this is, what are we actually trying to achieve? If we're using the law to try and move things forward, are we trying to reduce and eliminate coercive confinement, which is really what deprivation of liberty traditionally has been about? And I'd argue that's what Article 14 of the CRPD is really talking about, and the committee is talking about. Institutional confinement, compulsion. Or are we trying to reduce and eliminate arbitrary interference with people's autonomy? Those aren't actually exactly the same thing. And they might possibly point us in different directions as to where we might be wanting to focus our efforts. At what point does protection become discrimination? Now, let me just illustrate what I mean by that. In one of the cases before the Supreme Court, one of the individuals concerned, and I don't know anything about this individual other than what I've read in the judgments, but summarising the judgment in relation to her, she was a woman, young adult with profound learning disabilities, who had essentially very limited ability to care for herself, and she needed, and the court described it as, care and support with all the activities of daily living. She lived in a foster placement, an adult foster placement, with a woman she called Mummy. She was given loving care and support. She wouldn't have been allowed out. She never tried to leave. Had she left, her foster mother would have stopped her leaving. Apart from anything else, she didn't have any, apparently, had very little road sense. So it would have been very, very likely to have been run over by a car. But she's taken on family holidays. She's treated in every single way as a member of this person's family. Our Supreme Court has said she is deprived of her liberty because her foster mother is controlling and supervising her and not allowing her to leave, and this woman does not have the ability to consent. Now that, it seems to me, is a real, if that is what you are saying is where one gets to by deprivation of liberty, on one view, one is imposing, in the name of protection, and to try and avoid the risks that Yo so eloquently described of arbitrariness, of control. You're imposing on this person a framework called deprivation of liberty, which carries with it a whole series of intrusive checks. I don't know. I'm asking, I'd like your views on whether that really constitutes something we should be trying to pick up by deprivation of liberty, or whether what we're exercised about is the quality of care being given here being good. And are we actually, at least in England and Wales, I suspect in non-England, from discussions I've had, outside the UK, where very more limited definitions of deprivation of liberty arise, is probably not such an issue. In England and Wales, I suspect in some cases we're getting to almost the point of discriminating against people who aren't able to express the view that this is actually where they would like to be. We're saying, no, we're saying you're deprived of your liberty. And I wonder, in some cases, we're trying to protect and inadvertently discriminating. And the last question I want to ask is, how much can the law do? And what do we actually want it to do? I mean, unless we know what we want the law to do, we just blunder about. But I think so much of this, and Yo, I think, spoke very powerfully about this, a lot of this has absolutely nothing to do with the law. This has to do with how individuals providing care treat others with humanity, with dignity, with respect. The law can give a framework and a power to try and pick up some of the problems, but it's really it's outside the limits of the law to try and control every single aspect. Right, that's all I wanted to say, and I will now sit down so I can cease depriving you of your liberty, at least in this section.
Yes, good morning. It's very nice to be here somehow. As you heard before, I'm not a scholar of law. I'm a scholar of social work, so I will start using John Cleese's words and say now to something completely different. The institution I work for is a special institution, and it's the only institution in Denmark where we have secured wards. So everybody in Denmark who commits a crime will end up here. We have about 60 inmates, and we are no less than 600 employees to see for them, to take care of them. I'll look into two cases first about people with autism. And I'll translate for those few of you who can't understand the Danish. As you see here, this case is about a young man who was made graffiti on a stone in Denmark. Unfortunately, the stone was what we in Denmark call the Danish birth certificate. It's a very, very old stone, and it's a stone where the name the Danes are mentioned for the first time, so it's really a national treasure. He stood to 3 years in prison for vandalizing this national treasure, but because he had autism, he ended up to pay a compensation and a sentence to treatment. But on the other case here, we had a young man about same age who was parted in a violent attack on another young man with 3 other guys. They almost killed the guy. And there was no, what you call it, I have some, there was no discount here. He got the whole package to the prison, although he said was an autist. In Denmark, we have three, what you call it, ways to, when you have done something criminal, there are 3 ways to end up. One is if you are normal, another is, sorry for the word, another is if you have a psychiatric disease, and the third is if you have a learning disabilities. Here, all people with autism will fit in every place. For instance, if you have a normal IQ and a normal, what the judge and the psychiatric wards will, or the psychiatric will call a normal behavior, you will end up in a prison. And normally you will have a normal sentence. And there in the prison, there are very good professional people there. There are psychiatrists, psychologists, and priests, and everything here. The problem is for people with autism that prisons is a very bad place for them to be. There's always a risk of getting bullied or ending up in the bottom of the hierarchy or led astray. A good thing about prison is, if you call that a good thing, you know when you're getting out. At least you get out on that date, perhaps you even get out before. But if you have a sentence to treatment to a psychiatric ward, that means that your autism is so heavy, or you have some diagnosis beside the autism, you can end up on a secured ward, a psychiatric ward. Also here we got the very professional staff, doctors, social pedagogues, nurses, psychiatrists, almost like in prison. But again, here it's not a very good place for people with autism to be, because if any of you ever have been in a forensic psychiatry ward, you will know it's really unpleasant place sometimes. The people that are here have committed very, very serious crimes. They are heavily medicated. There are much noise, I think. And here sometimes there's a time limit, and sometimes there is no time limit. So you had to get well to get out. The third is where I work. If you have an IQ less than 70 or behavioral problems that gives you a psychiatric assessment that said you have a learning disability beside your autism, you are going to be placed under the social legislation on an institution for people with learning disabilities. And here is Kofoedsminde as such an institution with secured wards. The surroundings here are more homely. You got your own apartment, you have work all day, and you have a social pedagogic treatment, which I say it is almost 24 hours, but it's a little, maybe not quite right. But the social pedagogic treatment is based on relations and social skill training and recognition of the individual. The staff here is the staff, most social pedagogues, and there's not very much what you call staff from health services. For instance, at our place we have 60 inmates, or 60 residents as we call them, and these 60 residents have one psychologist, and we have one psychiatrist who comes every second week. That's it. Also here we have no limited in times, and some are time limited. The most normal is that you get a sentence for 5 years, and the reason is that when you come here, you have done something very severe. I will finish off with looking at some of the dilemmas, what I call the real world dilemmas, because there's a lot of good intentions in the legislations, but when you are in the place where I work, there's something that the reality is in conflict with intentions. For instance, the physical environments, we often have a lack of space. When you place people with autism spectrum disorders, it's very, very good to have a silent room, not too much noises, not too much disturbance, and it's difficult to avoid that when you are too many people, because that the space is too small. Well, also a lack of places. In the 10 years I've been working at Kofoedsminde, we have got 50% more places. And the advocate environments I talk about is that the apartments are, yes, probably. Sorry. The other thing is the contact to friends and family. It's very difficult when you place people in an institution in one end of the country to keep connections and to keep contact with your relatives and your friends. So often when you come to us, it gives you problems with your family. We try to do something with that by having a couple of apartments for visitors to stay in, and it's very cheap. And we have a staff problem, which infects us a lot. Because it's a very heavy work environment. We often had employees who resign. Therefore, we have a lot of new people coming in all the time. But that's a problem because it's difficult to get people who are trained and educated. So we have to take people in who have no education. And these people have to learn what it means to have a learning disability and what it means to have autism and what it means to say, the film yesterday, he's not naughty, he's autistic. That's often the problem because some of the new employees feel like it's a personal attack when something happens in conflicts. And that's something we have to train very much with the new staff and do it all the time, on and on again. And as I told you before, we have a culture, we have a change in paradigms in the 70s, 80s. Before that time, this field was ruled by doctors and nurses. And in the 70s and the 80s, it changed to a social pedagogic word. It went from healthcare to social care. And therefore, we are now over there, where we later were here. And some of us wanted to be here. But let's see what happened. We have some, what you call it, problems, not problems. We have a problem with the staff when they work here, because they have got double roles. And these roles can be conflicting. For instance, it's the same person who is a kind of guard and who is a caretaker. So you got control, and you got the nursing function into the same person, and that gives some problems. And that's a very good question that I like to discuss a lot, is that these people are punishable or not punishable. According to the Danish law, people with learning disabilities and autism will be not punishable. But we have decided, as you also probably, that when we punish people, we deprive them of their liberty. We don't tear out their nails, we don't hit them, we don't waterboarding or anything like that. We deprive them from their freedom. And if you ask some of them at my workplace, are you getting punished? Yes, they will say, yes, of course, you're depriving my freedom. But that's a funny thing, because according to the Danish law, there's a difference between when you are in the Danish penal, what do you call it? Sorry, I have to go back. Under the Danish penal code, then you are being punished. But when you're on the social code, you are not punished, although you are locked up. And that's last, I would say, there's a political neglect. I feel strongly. There's no political, it's a very small field, so the politicians don't do anything about it. Although I think I've seen a little moving forward the last 10 years, but it's very, very, very slowly. And we got a lot of finance work we need. And of course, I experienced that this is a field that has very, very less prestige. There's no doctors, no psychologists, very, very few doctors and psychologists who want to work in this field. So this is not good for the field. Yes. Sure.
I had a question for Søren. You talked about having a problem sort of in that secure setting between people having dual roles of being a guard and a caretaker.
Yes.
And I just wondered what work you do to sort of resolve that, if you can. What you do to try to resolve that.
Hello? That's the whole truth? Yes. Well, of course, we do what we can, but it is impossible to divide the two positions. You have to be both.
Yeah.
But we do what we can. If you have to do something, for instance, if you have to examine a room, which the law gives possibilities for weapons, for instance. If you have to examine a room, you get people from another apartment or from another ward to come over and do things like that. We try to keep the staff who works near to the citizens to do the nursery things only and not the controlled matters.
Okay.
We try to separate it, but sometimes it is impossible. Sometimes things go very fast, so then it's not possible. But I've seen other institutions where they've got two kinds of persons. In England, for instance, where they got officers and they got caretakers. Sometimes I think that would be a great idea, and sometimes I hate it.
Would anyone else from the panel like to comment on that issue? No? Great. Right, there's a gentleman at the back.
Aaron Meta of the Aaron Meta Show. I'm a talk radio host with autism. This is a hypothetical question. It's not a real scenario, so don't worry too much about that. An autistic person's got a Twitter account. He posts very controversial material. He's constantly barraged and threatened on Twitter, and he posts, I don't know, like nearby addresses to say, come pick a fight with me, something like that. And then someone steps in, closes down the Twitter account, and under his argument to protect him from himself. Is that a deprivation of liberty, or is that helping that person out? So basically, it's a free speech versus deprivation of liberty issue.
Who would like to address that? A very...
I could probably do it quite quickly in the sense of deprivation of liberty. It's a physical issue. It's a deprivation of your physical liberty, your ability to, at root, your ability to come and go from somewhere as you like. So liberty in the much broader sense of one's ability to live one's life as one likes, that's an aspect of autonomy, which is looked at least in the European Convention under Article 8, which is your right to personal autonomy, which mustn't be interfered with unless it's essentially necessary and proportionate, but it's got nothing per se to do with liberty.
Anyone else on the panel like to address that? It's an issue of real importance, I think, at the moment, as social media is burgeoning and so important in the lives of many autistic people. Do we have any other questions? Yeah. Oh yes, in the middle there.
Thank you. I was just wondering about the role of guardianship here, because if you have a legal guardianship in place, do all of the issues that you're talking about still apply, or do guardians take over decisions?
Who'd like to pick that up?
I just can say a few words on this, because that's what I said about the need to read Article 14, the criteria of the UN Convention, with Article 12, which is on legal capacity. In an ideal world, I mean, the UN Convention leads to the abolition also, if I may say so, of the guardianship as we know it, under the I would say the common and old criteria. That being said, and I understand the concerns of sometimes many parents of notably low-functioning adults with autism, saying, but this is an ideal world, but in the real life, these people cannot really, decide by themselves. They cannot express themselves, and so on and so on. So guardianship is still necessary, but not really under the old format. And coming back to this notion of guardianship, in the old, well, still, not in the old, still currently, the guardian decides in the best interest of, decide in place of. And now the criteria to be retained, and this has to be controlled by procedural safeguards by the judge and so on, and also the choice by a judge of a guardian must be on the basis of this. The idea is not to decide in the best interests of, the idea is to decide on the basis of the will, of the preferences, of the choices which are made day after day by the person. To think that if I decide in this direction, it is because I know he or she likes this. Not because I think it is in the best interest of, because I know on the basis of the knowledge of the person I have, what he likes, what he dislikes, how he's happy, with what he's happy. For example, I just can take, any, just let's say, it's an example which has nothing to do with the deprivation of liberty, because I think no one likes to be deprived of his or her liberty. But let's say if I see that such or such person doesn't like the sun, that's too hot, doesn't like the crowd, I'm not going to go in the south of France for vacation, for example. That's not in the, not only in the best interest, but that's not the choice he would make. You see how a guardian now needs to be controlled on. You decide in the best interest. That's not the criteria. Of course, That's interesting. That's not the criteria. The criteria is to decide according to the will, to the preferences, to the choice, which could have been made by this person on the basis of the knowledge we have of what makes him or her happy or not. I don't know if I'm clear on that, but that's really the criteria to be retained now.
Well, so are you saying that most guardianships across Europe at the moment are inconsistent with the UN?
Actually, yes,
Human
because
rights?
the UN criteria on Article 12 is really to abolish the old form of guardianship. That doesn't mean, I mean, there's also a semantic wording process, because I'm not so, I mean, as a lawyer, I mean, the word guardianship doesn't bring nightmares to me. That's not the idea, because guardian is also protection, but it must not be a deciding place of. It must really be even in the worst situations where in fact for anyone else you have the feeling that the person cannot decide. If you rely on these criteria of knowing the will and the preferences of the person, then you take a decision that's not your decision. You take, the decision that he would take if he could express, because you have sufficient criteria to know what he likes. So it's also a guardianship, but not with better criteria.
Would you like to address this?
Yeah, I'd just like really to, mostly to reinforce what Evelyn said, that I mean, anyone who came to the workshop I gave earlier this morning will already know my views on this, but it seems to me that the reason for the dilemma is the current situation in most European jurisdictions around mental capacity itself. And Article 12 of the UN Convention, if it were to be implemented across European jurisdictions, would result in individuals who struggle to make their own decisions being supported as much as is necessary, and retaining the fundamental legal right to make decisions for themselves. And that would mean that there would be no more substituted decision-making in the form of guardianship, and that even somebody who needed a very extreme level of assistance with making decisions would be able to have some control over who might be appointed as their representative to act on their behalf as their agent. And that creates the possibility in relation to deprivation of liberty that if someone cannot be judged to lack the legal capacity, then they can consent to being cared for in circumstances which might otherwise be seen to deprive them of their liberty. And I think that this is one approach to answering the question that Alex raised about have we ended up in a situation, for example, in England, where the definition of liberty has become too broad. And it seems to me that the purpose behind the Supreme Court's judgment in that case was an attempt to avoid discrimination, an attempt to avoid disabled adults being treated in a fundamentally different way to others in society. But it seems to me that the solution to that would be to restore the legal capacity of all adults in society, including the most profoundly affected autistic adults, so that they have the same legal rights as anyone else. Then it's possible to have a narrower definition of liberty, because it is possible for that adult to consent to be cared for in circumstances that might otherwise deprive them of their liberty, in the same way that any other adult could consent, for example, to have an anaesthetic to undergo surgery.
Okay.